This is a fantastic program that we're going to have today. And the reason why I think it's so important is because so much of the diversity conversation, I think, talks about the moral imperative. And the moral imperative of diversity and equity and inclusion is fine. It's a topic that needs to be talked about, but I think that's hard at this point to find a unique angle on that. Where I think we're going to find some uniqueness today is, where does DEI fit in the strategic vision of a successful business? How do you make yourself a more successful business? Forget about the moral imperative, or put that to the side for a second. What's in it for the business to do that? Because that means, for a lot of businesses, mine included, by the way, that requires change, and change is painful, change is risky, change is frightening. And in order for us to embrace those things, there's got to be something on the other end of the rainbow to do that. And Kemi is really the right person at the right time to talk about this. His presentation is titled DEI Leadership from Uncertainty to Action and Opportunity. Kemi is CEO and DEI strategist at Fears Advantage LLC. He's on a mission to help 5 million business leaders advance equity in their organizations by 2030. I have a feeling he's going to beat that by a country mile. But to create companies where people of all backgrounds can work safely and thrive. Kemi's a positive, highly engaging speaker who uses a unique combination of inspirational stories, music, and group interaction to create a dynamic experience audiences never forget. And I can tell you that's true, because I've become addicted to his YouTube channel. He was raised in Miami, Florida, as a first-generation Haitian American, and lived in a single-parent household with 9 siblings, where poverty, violence, and racial inequity traumatized him at an early age. And he's risen above that, and is a graduate of both the University of Miami and Nova Southeastern University. With 2 decades of leadership experience, Kemi has worked with several Nobel Peace Prize winners to inspire social justice initiatives in over 40 countries around the world. And in 2012, he led a 22,000-mile kindness tour across North America. Kemi Joseph, I'm going to get out of the way. Welcome to CEO Netweavers, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you very much for the powerful introduction, as well as setting the context. I very much appreciate the opportunity. Thank you all for being here, and also thank you for the work that you're doing, just being able to hear and welcome the new members as well. I appreciate you all, and I'd like to level set with a spoken word piece that I wrote on behalf of Dr. King and all those who have paved the way for us to even be here right now. I see every day as a beautiful gift, which is why I'm using mine to close this racial rift. We can't sit back to watch the world as it splits, so I'm going full force like an NFL blitz. I'm thankful for my rights and my freedom of expression. That's why I'm using mine to leave a positive impression. We gotta end the hatred, bloodshed, and oppression. It's a long road ahead, but stop is out of the question. Science even proves it. We all come from the same place. So we gotta put an end to the fight and then unite the human race. For all those starving, let's make food for their plates. And all those hurting, there's so many people hurting. Their pain, let's alleviate. That's why compassion bursts from my heart like a geyser. And I'm gonna give it all prior to my expire. Yes, my skin is brown and my passion is fire. And they're permanent like stripes on a tiger. In this world of racism, it might make me a target, but I'm invulnerable because love is eternal. That's what I keep in my skull. And yes, I'm gonna love you whether you're a friend or foe, because spreading love brings hope, and hope is wonderful. Do me a favor, type the word hope in the chat if you can use more hope in your life, hope in your company, hope in your community. Type the word hope in the chat. And for me, the word hope can be broken down to an acronym that means humans overcome problems every day. That's why I have hope. And I see that we have so many problems in our world. So to help you all overcome some more of those, talk about the moral imperative, and talk about as well as the business imperative. That's what I'm here to do. So thank y'all for giving me the opportunity, especially as we have this conversation of DEI leadership from uncertainty to action and opportunity. And all of these things were already mentioned, that we're Fears Advantage. For me, that stands for fuel, equitable, actions, relationships, and systems. So how do we take the things that are pushing us away from each other to actually help us create the journey towards togetherness, but also towards a better future compared to the past that we've had? And as was said, we're on this mission to to help 5 million leaders advance equity in their organizations. And yes, we want to create more work environments where employees can work safely and thrive as part of our bigger vision of creating a world where every human being can live safely and thrive. And with that, we really are focusing on working with purpose-driven leaders like yourselves. And everything I've heard affirms that we're in the right place right now. And regardless of your actual title in the organization, the idea of being a leader, I would love for y'all to put your titles in the chat just to see who's represented in this room, because I know everybody has different titles. The idea of being a leader who's driven by a purpose to make things better. And oftentimes that's why we started our companies. That's why we show up as individuals and even do these things on our free time. So for us, with the conversation around DEI that has been so intense and polarizing, we really want to make diversity, equity, inclusion something that's approachable, actionable, profitable, and even enjoyable in your organization. Imagine having more joy in these conversations. I don't know about you, but that's something I certainly want more of in my life. And so for today, and this time, I'll just cover the objectives to make sure we're all on the same page. Is that one, we will be modeling lessons from Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. to help you keep your team engaged and committed to DEI. Two, we want to flip the script on privileges so you can create the innovative solutions that are needed to thrive in this era. And then also help you drive real behavior change that creates the environment for people to thrive in your organization. So we're not even asking you to save the world. Notice that most of this is about you and your team and how we can support you regardless of your background, your current position, or your levels of privilege, how we can support you and being the kind of leader who does that. And as we continue on, the reason we titled it From Uncertainty to Action and Opportunity is COVID rocked the world in so many ways, including really shaking our perception of what's possible, what our plans are. I don't know if any of you had a 10-year plan like I did, but that just went out the window and had to really pivot, a lot of pivots. But I love this quote that discusses what we can do in times of uncertainty. And as I share this quote, I want to thank you not only for your continued effort as a leader, but also thank you for joining this conversation, because you could have run away if you wanted to. And I want y'all thinking about what's a problem that you can solve by running away from it. I have not found that problem yet, but I know that when everything is uncertain, what is important becomes clear. When we have all this uncertainty, what is important becomes clear. And I want to know for you all, what became clear for you this year? And one thing became clear for us, that there's way more fear in the world, there's way more uncertainty, there's way more friction. So we're asking people to unsubscribe from the divide, to actually go towards what they need to do to make real change, as opposed to just giving lip service. And for Dr. King, as he understood the future of African Americans was uncertain, he said we have to do something different. It became very clear that he couldn't just fight violence with more violence. Instead, he had to unbias his leadership and say change can happen in a different way. As Mike said earlier, change is already uncomfortable, frustrating, but I love this quote from Dr. King that says, always fight with love. So when the day comes that the walls of segregation completely crumble, we will be able to live with people as their neighbors. As we're talking about fighting with love, maybe those words don't necessarily relate to people, but I would also encourage you then to lead with integrity. So as the world continues changing, people can work with you as their team members. They can trust you as a leader. This is what we're actually here to do. We're talking about not only the change and the benefits, but sometimes the change within us, because we often can be the ones who prevent change, which is why, again, when we talk about fears here, we're going to focus on the fuel portion. And we will let you know, we've been saying this to every leader who will listen, that you're either fueling fires or forward progress in your organization. And many people say they're fueling forward progress. We're like, oh, great, let's start there then. Let's talk about where we actually want to go. And so we'll ask folks, Martin Luther King had an epic dream of the world he wanted to see. We ask people, what is their dream or what is their vision of DEI in their organization? And we have people tell us incredible things. I want to have a more diverse team. I want people to feel included. I want people to feel like they can come here and feel safe in our organization, that they have a pathway to succeed, that they can see themselves in senior leadership, that we as an organization can be more profitable. There is legitimate statistics that will show that diverse teams are more innovative as well as more profitable than teams who are not as diverse. So people will tell us this all the time. We're like, fantastic. And as they're starting to cast this vision, what's important is that we start to illuminate that DEI is bigger than just a conversation for minorities, that DEI is a solution framework that can help everyone in your organization. This is very important, especially as we see that the country is locked in race wars or race conversations. But in our organizations, that may not necessarily be the case. And as we go towards advancing equity for people of different skin colors and race and ethnicity, this has become one piece of a larger puzzle. So I'm going to load these different parts to just talk about, for an individual, these are the ways that we can identify. And these identities then impact our leadership, how we show up as a leader, who we feel more comfortable leading, who we don't bring on our team because we don't have a connection or we don't want to deal with the differences that it would require us to change how we might lead. And then we start to add social factors. Then we start to add career factors. Then we start to add life experiences. And we're saying that every single one of you in this room is a combination of this diagram. And then you start adding employees. Go ahead and type in the chat, how many employees do you have? Or how many people on your team? I know many of you are high levels in your organizations. How many people are on your team or within your organization? Let's just see there. So some of y'all says the highest number I see is 117. So you have 117 different people coming in your organization, which are a mix of this. And this is what intersectionality, all right? The highest number I see now is 200. All right, so you have even more chaos going on here. And it's important that when we can talk about it as chaos, so we can see the real opportunity is to create a culture of equity where every single person can be honored for their combination of diversity. Even if you don't have the visual diversity, understanding that every single person in your organization has a combination of these different factors that makes up who they are and how they lead and how they're affected by leadership. So for us, creating a culture of equity is a systematic effort to advance people of all diversities in your organization. And the interesting thing here is that, again, we have many people say, yes, I'm about that. That sounds amazing. I would love to see more of that in our organization. We believe that we are innovators. We're moving things forward. We are purpose-driven and people who are here to serve. And then we ask them, okay, so what gets in the way? Right? Because if it was that easy, we would have already done it. So what gets in the way? I'd love to hear some of what y'all share in the chat, and we'll share some of the common pieces. What do you think gets in the way? And as we start talking about what gets in the way, it's interesting for us to say, instead of talking about the elephant in the room, I want to talk about the bomb in the room. Because many of us are concerned that this DEI conversation is going to explode in our face, going to blow up in our faces. And so when we start talking about what gets in the way, we see that oftentimes companies will struggle with 5 issues or 5 problem areas. And so the first one is probably, you can imagine, the people. Oh man, our company's made of people and people come with problems. And so we have people problems. Sometimes people say, hey, we don't have a diverse team, or we don't have a diverse pipeline. And we're also struggling with people feeling safe in our organization to bring things up and address issues. So we're seeing people issues. And then generally people issues will create process issues. Some people don't want to work with each other. They're not communicating with each other. We have these microaggressions or passive aggressive behavior. When politics come up, people just keep their head down, don't even talk. As a community, when we have processes about feedback, we're not actually asking our team to give us feedback on our leadership. We're just leading in the way that we used to lead, which is not as helpful in this world that continues to change. Then we're talking about policies here, and we start to see that some policies feel unfair, or that some people are even getting paid more than other people are getting paid, and that there's these implied glass ceilings, or that policies are enforced differently for different groups of people. So why would I continue to follow a policy that is not fairly applied across the board? Then we start seeing production issues. We can't produce at the same level. We also see performance issues in this category where teams are saying, hey, if I don't necessarily see myself in leadership, I consider this a dead end job. If it's a dead end job, why should I give my best every day? It doesn't even make sense. So then my production decreases. And people are then also having struggles with different producing for diverse audiences. And then we start to see profit problems. This is the first time we've ever had companies reach out to us and say, we're losing business or we're not getting contracts because our team isn't as diverse as our competitor. And visual diversity, as I mentioned, what people can see on someone's website, or talking about diversity of thought. We're not necessarily moving our product forward or competing in a diversifying marketplace because we're trying to do the same things we were doing before. And by the time it becomes a profit problem, it's one of the most expensive versions of this problem. But we know that all big fires start as small fires. So we want to be able to help you to put some of these out as a strategic focus in this conversation. And I will also let you know that as individual leaders, that many of these problems start with our bias and are fueled by our bias. And this was very clear to me in a recent conversation that I had with a company where we assessed their whole team as part of a strategic planning initiative. And then I had a meeting with, there are several people, but the three that stand out to me were the CEO, one of the managers, and one of the employees. And as we were sharing the data, that many of their employees did not feel safe, or that they did not feel like their words were being included, or their voice was included in decisions that impact them. They were saying things about glass ceilings or about, again, unfair policies, all the problems I just outlined to you. Interesting, the CEO, the CEO is also the founder of the company, so they've been there the longest, and their experience was totally different. They couldn't really connect to the data and almost felt defensive. Like, how can this be happening in our company? I check in with my team every day. Do they not know how much I do for them outside of the company to continue bringing revenue? I feel like I'm being attacked. And the managers there are saying, well, I hear your concerns, and I see this every day. Somebody just left and we had an exit interview with them, and the managers described me how this person literally left because they didn't see any career opportunities, or they didn't necessarily see how this company was wanting to take action on DEI, not just talk about it, not just form a committee that's more so like a book club. They actually, that employee left, and they told their manager they left because they weren't seeing true action behind this DEI initiative. And meanwhile, there's another employee there. And while all these high-level people are going back and forth, this employee just kind of watching and taking notes. So I asked, hey, what are you seeing here? Right? What are you seeing? Like, you're with everybody else. And the employee said, I know this DEI can be very hard, but I see that at least my managers check in on me. And they want to, when things are going on outside of our company, they at least check in to see how I'm doing. I feel like they actually care about me. I don't necessarily know what everything else is happening in the company, but at least I feel like my direct manager cares about me. And I share all of this with you to ask you a question. What do you see? What did you see? I gave you three positions: CEO, manager, and employee. And I even gave you two different employees, one who quit and one who was still there in that meeting. Who did you see in those roles? Who was the CEO? What was the demographics? Did you see any gender as the CEO? Any skin color as a person who was the CEO? Who did you go to? You can pop them in the chat. I see Eric there laughing. I'd love to get your thoughts, Eric. I can ask you to unmute here. Who did you see in those different positions?
A white male. It was the CEO. And the manager employee, I had no opinion, but I'll just be honest. I envisioned a white man.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I appreciate the honesty, Eric.
Yeah.
And then that, that we saw CEO as a white male, and so maybe the manager. Did you see anybody as the employee then?
I didn't, to be honest with you.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. So employee was just there in the ether. So I appreciate you, Eric. Can I get one more? Can I get one more person to share? Or you can again put them in the chat. Thank you there for sharing, Eric. Barry said, I saw myself in each role over time. Interesting. Okay, saw myself in each role over time. What else did y'all see there, people?
As you talked about the employee, I thought that they were some in the minority of some kind of way. I didn't necessarily know if it was of color or gender, but I felt like they were definitely in the minority. The manager, I didn't have an opinion, but like Eric, I thought the CEO was a white male.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I just heard a voice come. That's Kelly. Thank you. If that's you, Kelly. Thank you. And it's interesting too, as I'm seeing here in the chat, that the assumed the employee was younger, employees were Black, manager and CEO were white. Now we can have a whole dialogue about this scenario that y'all are building in your minds, but I will say that all of that is implicit bias, right? I didn't give you any demographic information about folks. I just gave you their positions and their kind of input on this conversation. And some people want to be like, oh crap, there's a bias, and they want to just run away. That's not what we're here to say. I'm just letting you know that each one of those positions approaches change differently. And we already looking at these folks and thinking about the biases of who we believe are in those positions. Even if we didn't necessarily associate positive or negative about them, we're already seeing who's in those positions. And so for us, that implicit bias conversation is one version to say that people think bad people have bias. And I want you to think about this differently. It's not bad people who have bias. We all have bias. And that you don't have to be bad to get better about navigating your implicit bias. Because especially for us, we see implicit bias as info filled in by us. Meaning that right now you all just added some great detail to these stories, and you might be thinking about times that you are in these meetings or conflicts that you might be currently experiencing. But we filled in this information. If we fill this in this information, then we also have the opportunity to change the information when we go about moving forward. And people are constantly asking about, how do we learn implicit bias? We learned it as babies. We learned it just the ways we learned to walk and talk. We learned it through the media. It oftentimes feels like we're being imprinted on. This is how bias shows up in our lives. And it's almost impossible to see the world without bias. You know, we're even asking people to answer the question, what's the difference between communicating honestly and communicating biasly? And this is the kind of conversation we're getting to in coaching conversations to really help people unpack this, especially when we look at what's the difference in leading honestly or leading biasly. So as we start to break this down, we want to apply the principles that we teach folks for unbiasing their leadership to organizational change. So that way we can shift what we perceive are the barriers to change and really think through, again, using tools from like Dr. King, how can we create what might even feel impossible right now? How can we lay the foundation for continued improvement, for continued thriving? Type the word thrive in the chat if you would like people, and yourself included in your organization, to thrive. Fantastic. So as we see bias, we talked about this a moment ago, is it both the match and the fuel to many fires? And we have our process for helping to redirect and even reduce and replace bias, which is called our building blocks of bias. And it focuses on these elements of context, evidence, meaning, choice. And they are brought together with awareness. So our building blocks of bias, I will cover a few of these, but this is our process called the building blocks of bias, which is going to help in this conversation really unbias our view of change in a way that allows us to go back to our organizations and be those leaders that we truly say we want to be in the world. And especially when we jump into awareness, we can say that our success is only as big as our awareness. Some people don't even know what's possible with DEI. They think that it is asking people to always go and protest or be in rallies. It's like that is one version of what it looks like for social injustice. But in our organizations, are we seeing DEI again as a solution framework, and not just for minorities, to raise the tide for all or everyone in our organizations? And so with that, we're going to ask you to stop thinking so small about DEI and to really, this conversation is an invitation to expand. And because we are wanting to expand the view, we will let you know that part of the reason people are struggling with DEI is because it's only been around for 20 years. The words DEI, diversity, equity, inclusion. Even the conversation around diversity and inclusion has only been around for 60 years. So if we look at that, it's a very small time frame in the scope of the world, especially in the scope of us as business owners. So it's important to know that DEI has only been around for 20 years. Some of y'all talked about having grandkids and kids. If you've raised somebody or you're working with people who are 20 years old, you know, they're confused, anxious, frustrated, have a lot going on. That's the same thing that's happening with our whole world as we are talking about DEI. But we also know that if we just look at the innovator adoption cycle, that because it's so young, we are mainly talking to innovators right now. Anybody who is even grappling with this conversation to move it forward in your organization, you are already in the innovator cycle, which is important to understand, because then this is part of the reason that there's so many conflicts and misunderstandings about it. So you need to be somebody who's educated in this in order to move your team along it, along the journey, especially moving from diversity and inclusion to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And the simplest way I could try to define this for folks who are new to this is that equity is just being fair, is being just, fair, and impartial. We can say that equity is just being fair. And it's really hard in a world where people say, well, the world's unfair or life is unfair. So then are you wanting to continue perpetuating unfairness, or are you wanting to be somebody who's different and say that I want to reduce harm? This is why we literally are talking to purpose-driven leaders. Because anybody else who's just motivated by what everybody else is doing is going to just continue the same inequities that everybody else is continuing. So it's important that reason we focus on leaders. I have worked in initiatives that are from the ground up and grassroots. And like Dr. King, we can really rally a lot of people. When I think about Dr. King's work, I really like to focus on the beginning when he was leading the Montgomery bus boycott. And the interesting thing is, over the course of a year, they had about 40,000 people protest the buses. And it only took 9 Supreme Court justices to say that segregation on the buses was unconstitutional. Some of y'all said you have 200 employees. You might be one of few who makes a huge decision. If we look at diversity and inclusion, as those buses were technically diverse and inclusive. They had Black and brown people on the buses alongside of white people. They did not have equity though. Those buses did not have equity, because when a white passenger came on, the Black passenger had to go to the back of the bus or even get off or even be threatened for just doing what they were told they could do. So when we're talking about diversity, equity, inclusion, the conversation becomes, are there still employees in your organization who feel like they're having to move to the back of the bus or even being kicked off of the bus simply for who they are? And we're seeing that conversation happen. If you didn't know that that's what's happening in your organization, it is happening. We're trying to reduce the degree to which that is happening and increase the ability for more people to experience equity. So with that being said, when we're in this awareness piece, I want us to establish a baseline for how we perceive change. We're talking about DEI. A lot of people have a lot of different variations of what they think is being asked of them. So I just want you to write this to yourself. You don't actually have to share this to anybody in this room, but I want you to write here, what change do you have resistance towards in your organization? What change do you have resistance towards in your organization? Some people say we want to have more diverse people, but then they don't actually go look for them. And they say it takes too much money or costs too much. We don't have those kind of connections. Well, that's a resistance to making new connections. That's a resistance to really diversifying your approach to reaching and building trust in diverse communities. Some folks say we want to increase pay, but oh man, it's going to cost a lot more money. We want to have more senior leadership. Does that mean we got to fire somebody? All those things are resistance. And as you are putting the resistance and you're writing them down, I appreciate you for even exploring this, because this is where the work begins. I also want you thinking, if we put resistance on a scale, if we rate these things on a scale of 1 to 10, there's some change that we're just avoiding doing. We're kind of delaying it for another time. And there's some change that we're preventing from happening. Again, you don't have to share this, but I want you to be honest with yourself. When you're thinking about your resistance to change or these different changes that are coming up that people are asking for, are you in this 1 to 4 realm where you're avoiding it? Is it a change that you might put in this spot of like, I'm not avoiding it, I'm taking, but I also know that I'm struggling with it? And let's be honest with ourselves, what are the changes that are directly preventing? I'm just gonna play a little bit of music here and give you a chance to write this. Again, you don't have to share what you're writing in this portion, but I do want you to write it for yourself, thinking about what's coming up for you as you pinpoint the changes that you are struggling or avoiding bringing into your organization. And so Jim says, I love change and challenge. So resistance is towards not changing. And I appreciate that for sure. I'm one of those folks who I believe that about myself as well. And the interesting thing is I often then will resist people who resist change, and I don't want to bring them into the fold. So then I realize, I start to see how I avoid them, and I avoid being as inclusive as I can be. Like, what is it that they want to bring along? And sometimes I miss out on those opportunities to involve more people who have a different belief than I do about change. And what about resisting hiring people who are younger, right? We know age is certainly a bias that persists. Some people resist even having younger people. As they say, millennials believe that they expect more, or they have this entitlement. What if it's that they have high expectations for the workplace and are going to give their highest level when they know an employer is going to take care of them? So we might also have resistance towards seeing other people's perspectives when it's different from us, or resistance to changing our onboarding process, or as some people might describe it, our hazing process. You have to go do these, you have to go through it if you're ever going to get to this leadership position. It's like, does that still have to be the case right now? Is there a different way for us to onboard and train people that doesn't have to be maybe as traumatizing as it has been for us when we went through our journey? And again, you don't have to share the change that you might be struggling with, but what's coming to mind for you in terms of when we look at awareness? It's always awareness of our thoughts, our emotions, and our reflexes. What's coming up for you right now as you are looking at the change that you may have resistance towards?
Well, Remy, I think the onboarding as hazing was really, I'd never thought about it that way. I mean, that's an amazing thought. And I also think about, the concept of pay your dues, right?
Mhm.
Just suck it up and pay your dues, and really, that is a little bit like hazing, right? I had to do it that way, and so do you. And I don't care, so I just think that's really interesting and something I think a lot about.
Yeah, thank you, Eric. And this is why we were letting people know that DEI is not just about this, how we are supporting people because they have a different skin color. It's like, are we willing to reduce barriers that prevent people from thriving or really showing up fully in our organization? So I appreciate that caught your attention. Anybody else want to share? We have about 40 of y'all on this call. We've heard from like 3 people. Who else?
Hey, Kenny, I'll go as Kelly again.
Mm-hmm.
But I was actually in another networking event earlier in the week, and somebody said, hey, we're looking to be more diverse and we want to hire. And so, and it was interesting because the first thing I thought was, is it tokenism? Is it assimilation? Like, nobody wants to be the diversity hire, and thought it could be an opportunity for me to reach out to that person who is in the position to maybe educate and say, to educate, but then thinking through what you're saying, that was my bias. you know,
Mhm.
maybe they have that already set up. Maybe they've thought through it. So really, it will change the conversation to be more inquisitive and just ask versus jump into assumptions there.
I appreciate that, Kelly, too, because we're in that one. We have that same conversation. Like that's probably the top conversation we're having. And even before we get into that, we're asking, you know, what are the ways that they're honoring diversity currently in their organization? It's just to find out, because you know, I'll say, you know, I don't want to recruit people for you if we're going to send them into a toxic environment. Like, how are you checking in on your culture? And some people even have resistance to doing assessments and finding out what's happening in their organization. But we're always telling people, assess before you make a mess. Assess instead of make a mess. And this is interesting too. The last point I'll share that on this is, you know, some Jim said there in the chat as well about people resistant to team building. You know, sometimes people are also resistant to talking about change just as a whole. And the diversity hire can also become an issue where someone says, hey, like I'm right here inside the company. How come I wasn't considered for that job? And now because we didn't check in and we didn't assess, we're making the mess of saying this person feels overlooked for the job. So no matter who we hire, that person is going to be seen as a threat. And then that that type of action continues to permeate in our culture. So when we're asking what type of change are we resistant to, are we also resistant to checking in with our team and asking questions that we haven't asked before, the ones that we feel uncomfortable asking, to make sure that we're doing it better. So thank y'all for being able to put in the chat and follow along in this journey. This is what I'm saying. This is the real work here. I'm excited. And that's just the high level of this portion around awareness, for us to have a greater awareness around our bias towards change. And now we're going to be moving into a little bit about the evidence, because oftentimes when we have a bias towards something, we will have evidence around it that lets us know that it is either a good or a bad thing in our world. We start to put our qualifiers on it. So when we start talking about change, I will let you know for the evidence portion that your culture is happening by default or by design. This is, I would say, the truest thing I can tell you right now about culture. Is if we haven't been intentional, it's in time for us to be intentional, especially when things get intense. I'll tell you, the more intense this gets, the more intentional you have to be. So when we say by design, this is inviting you in to say, hey, if I am resistant to change, you can look at all those changes. How can I do it more intentional to make it more possible for me to lower my resistance, for our team to lower their resistance, for our team to do this more enjoyably? And with evidence, I'm going to give you a time to write about this. When it comes to DEI, I believe. Just finish that statement on your side. You don't have to write it in the chat. What do you believe about DEI? When it comes to DEI, I believe. And it can be that I believe DEI is a good thing. I believe DEI is a hard thing. I believe DEI is a complicated thing. What do you believe about DEI? So I'll play some more music for about a minute. David says, I believe DEI is about action, not words. I believe DEI is a great thing. We have wasted so much potential by artificially limiting large segments of our society. I believe DEI is about loving people. I appreciate y'all writing in chat. You don't have to if you don't want to, but you can. I just want you to look at what are the beliefs that you have about DEI and what it actually takes to do DEI well. Empathy. I believe it's hard to comprehend how much gap closing is really needed. I believe DEI, empowering all to achieve and celebrate it. I believe that I don't have all the answers. Yes, absolutely. And so I appreciate that most of y'all are putting in the chat positive things that you believe about DEI. And in general, when we're working with bias, most of us will talk about bias as only the negative. So we will, and because of this group, it seems very much, again, purpose-driven folks, we'll look at bias as both sides, right? So when we have a positive bias, like when I make a positive assumption about you and I get it right, people are like, oh man, you're so intuitive. Like you really heard me, you really saw me, you got me a gift that's perfect for me. You gave me an opportunity, a job. You gave me a task that is perfect for my skill set. So when we get it right, that's intuition. When we get it wrong, then people will call it bias, then people will call it prejudice, and people will label us as racist and go down this whole path. So it's interesting that when you're looking at your bias around DEI, a lot of y'all are rating the things that are positive. And we will acknowledge that there are many positive things about DEI, absolutely. And I appreciate those of you who also wrote the things that, you know, are hard and that feel difficult or feel frustrating about DEI. And what I want us to think about, that a belief is the thought that we keep thinking, it's a decision that we keep making. A belief is a thought that we keep thinking, is the decision that we keep making. So what I want to challenge us to do is to think through, what do we want to believe that DEI will do in our organizations? If we're talking about truly moving forwards, I want to believe that DEI will blank for blank. So I want to believe that DEI will help create a more inclusive environment for my team. I want to believe that DEI will help us serve our clients at a higher level. I want to believe DEI will help us be more profitable than our competition. What do you want to believe about DEI? Let's start there. And then when you're creating these beliefs, I want them to be positive. So something that feels helpful for you and for your team, want something that's equitable, that is actually fair. And also something that's empowering, that when you think about this statement, about what you want to believe, it feels like, man, all right, it's worth doing the hard work that it takes. That DEI is an investment. And as you're writing your statement, I will ask you to add one phrase at the end. Add "and for me too." So I want to believe that DEI will increase inclusion for all of our team members and for me too. I want to believe that DEI will increase thriving for all of our leadership and for me too. I want to believe that DEI will help us provide greater services for our clients and for me too. Absolutely, I love what I'm seeing in the chat. Yes. Right, it can help improve work interactions, including work interactions for you. It can help increase the quality of feedback that you can give to people and that you can receive. This is what I'm saying, that, and notice we're not even talking about race here, even in the answers that y'all shared here. If we can understand DEI from a fundamental level, that it gives more people the ability to win and thrive in a fair way. If we can get that on a fundamental level, then this can start to shift our biases towards what it would actually require to do it. Yeah, thank you. What I'm seeing in the chat, and we'll have more discussion during the Q&A portion after this. So I will leave this out here for now, because I want to close out with one other piece of the puzzle. So that was closing out the evidence portion, and you can see we're just doing very high level. And if you're having any struggle with this, just know that that is also common, and that to truly get into your own mind, this is where we offer executive coaching to be able to unpack some of these things, untangle, because a lot of these challenges or a lot of these changes that are being asked are coming from a lot of different sources, and some people are truly are causing more harm as they go about making positive change. Like that means the change to me is not as positive. So how do we make change without harm while reducing harm? These are the ways, these are the more challenging versions of these conversations. So I'll give you, and you'll have my contact info afterwards if you want to follow up and have deeper conversations. But as we close out with choice here, I will let you know that having bias is not your fault. What you do with it is your responsibility. Your responsibility. We will rephrase responsibility is your ability to respond. So the fact that you're in a leadership position, you have the ability to respond at a completely different level of influence than somebody else who's a brand new employee. This is what we're talking about. We're not asking you to necessarily change the world. We're saying by changing your business, your culture, creating more safe spaces for people to work, you actually do start to change people's lives. We spend most of our lives, most of our adult lives at work. So if people are investing their time and their attention in your company, are you investing in them? So when we start to have a conversation about this, we'll tell you, I love this from Dr. King, it's always the right time to do the right thing. If you've been waiting for somebody to tell you, hey, let's get started, I'll tell you right now is the time to step it up. And one of the conversations that people often struggle with is privilege. So I want to close out by just helping to reframe privilege. So when we see these groups in red, what I want you to do is put in the chat just a number. How many people or how many of these groups in red do you identify with? So we have white people, boys/men, cisgender people, which means that you present in the same way, or that you identify in the same way that you present. So my name is Kemi. I look like a male. I present like a male. I feel like a male. So then you got wealthy, upper middle class or homeowners. You have heterosexual or straight people. You have adults who are age 18 to 65. You have native English speakers, Christians, and people without disabilities. Just put a number in the chat. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Like, how many do you identify with? There are 9 total. How many do you identify with? Okay. So thank y'all for rolling along. So we have the highest being 9 or all of them. And then so far, the lowest I'm seeing is 5. Now, what about these groups here in the white bubbles? We have people of color, women, girls. We have transgender or gender nonconforming. We have financially poor or working class, LGBTQIA. We have youth ages 1 through 17 or adults 65 and older, non-native English speakers, non-Christians, and people with disabilities. How many of the groups inside and the groups in white do you identify with? So I got 0 is the lowest, 2, 1, 8, 0, 4. So this is interesting because this is how privilege is generally discussed in this conversation, especially when we look at privilege in America, for example. And it's often said that the folks who are identified with the red are generally oppressing or marginalizing those groups who identify with the white. And it's important to say that this is how it has been showing up: unfair standards, intimidation, threats, misrepresentation, abuse. And this is us using our privilege as inequity. And most people are like, all right, this is it. Thank you for knowing that you're bad people, and then fade to black and it's over. We're like, well, this is not where the conversation stops. We actually need to take it a step further and say, what can we do with this instead? So what if we are using our privileges and we're turning our focus to using our privileges to increase equity, creating equitable standards, setting equitable goals, helping to protect and empower employees, have more diverse representation, create more economic status by, again, more economic reward for their work, increasing accessibility, granting status. So this is interesting. This is us using privilege as equity, and on a larger scale as a country, this would be us creating a culture of equity. Now, some of y'all might say, man, this is awesome, and I don't have control to do that for people in other areas of the world or other areas in the US. So I'm going to ask us to bring the context down a little bit. So I'm going to put the list of privileges that happen in the workplace. Which of these privileges am I currently experiencing in my workplace? So you can just, again, put a number there at the end. So we have, I feel emotionally and psychologically safe in my company. I have job stability. I have a salary that reflects my contributions/efforts to the company. My voice is included in decisions that directly impact me. People follow through on my requests and directives. I trust my team and they trust me. I have a senior leadership position, or I have a pathway to senior leadership. And I have the tools and support to do my best work every day. So of these 8, how many of them do you have? So if someone says all 8. So notice, this is not saying, hey, my gender has put me there. My skin color has put me there. My ability to speak English has put me there. It's just saying, this is what I'm experiencing right now. Most of y'all are rating at a higher level, and there's some who have, the lowest so far I'm seeing is 4. We have many of these. And so when we switch privilege into this context of privilege being the things that we experience on a day-to-day basis, most of the things that we're grateful for show up on this, will show up in our privilege list in terms of what we are grateful for in terms of the workplace. So our question for you as we close this out is to ask yourself, you can take a screenshot of this question and write it down. How can I help increase access to the privileges I enjoy most inside my company? So if you enjoy being on senior leadership, are you helping to carve a path for others to get to senior leadership as well? If you enjoy having job stability, what are you doing to provide that for other people? If you enjoy feeling safe and feeling like people include your voice in the decisions, are you doing that for your team? Now we can do this in a sense of, regardless of the diverse makeup of your team, if you're doing this from this previous slide here, you would be increasing equity. You would be increasing inclusion. And then as you diversify your team, they will say, oh, fantastic, this company actually does take care of us. This is how we can truly move from just being an ally, to being what we call an advancer, somebody who's looking ahead and paving the way for people who are yet to come, but also who are solving problems before our team even has to deal with them, who are making sure that we're increasing equity. And I'm not sure if you knew this, but when they had the Montgomery boycott, they just started with one day. They say, hey, what if we just try this for one day and see if it works? And then it did work. So they kept on going. This is how we move from microaggressions to micro progressions. Where we're saying, hey, why don't we just try this one thing? What if I focus on one of those privileges and start giving my team more access to it? Then I can start building momentum. And it's important for us to know that this is how we can start making change more and more accessible. So that was a very high level of our building blocks of bias. So we can actually use things like context, evidence, meaning, and choice, as well as awareness to unbias our leadership. This is a pathway to unbiasing your leadership, is tackling your own biases, especially your biases related to change. And what's interesting here is we see this over and over again. When people start to unbias their leadership, they can resolve their people issues relatively quickly. I had one client who said, hey, I want to fire my whole team. They're not working hard. I was like, whoa, that's a lot. That costs a lot of money to fire a whole team. But when we started to reshape her focus, it was about how do we get the best out of your team? So there's boom, we started to shift how she treated them. And then the processes that they were in, including how they set goals and setting more equitable goals so the team could reach them. And then what are the policies they put in place for their team to be able to actually collaborate and have more say in the development of their product, which helped them to resolve production issues. And in working together for only 3 months, they had 2 of their largest months of profit by shifting this. And that was beautiful for us because that was the beginning of their journey and working with them to actually create cultural equity. So if we put out the fires, we are much closer to creating this where our folks can feel that they are in the right place. So I will tell you now that you're always one choice away from better relationships with your team. You're always one strategy away from a better culture. And you're always one call away from having a better experience as a leader. So I will invite y'all at the end of this to schedule a call with me if you would like some support in being able to do this in your organization. And we call it a needs discovery call. I want to discover what's actually happening for you. Not everybody needs the same strategies, and help you get what you need to be that kind of leader who can unbias your leadership and unbias change in your organization. Leaving you with this finally, that nothing in your life will change for the better until you do.
Take yourselves off mute and give this man a hand clap. That was excellent.
That was amazing.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you. So I will now stop the recording. So everybody who's watching the recording, bye.